Good day. A couple of days ago, I did a program on the strange whinging interview that President Zelensky of Ukraine gave to Axios, in which he complained bitterly about the United States' decision to waive sanctions on the German operator of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, and about President Biden's decision to hold a meeting with President Putin of Russia later in June, on 16th June 2021. I discussed in that video the degree to which Zelensky specifically, and probably Ukraine, or at least the Ukrainian government generally, seem to feel bitterly betrayed by the United States and by President Biden and by the new administration in particular. We have now had further illustrations of this with some increasingly strange, indeed even bizarre actions on the part of President Zelensky. Specifically, shortly after the Axios interview, the Biden White House, presumably feeling embarrassed by Zelensky's comments, did agree to speak with Zelensky over the phone, or at least they set up a telephone conversation between Zelensky and US President Biden. Now, in the hours after that telephone conversation took place, President Zelensky's press people circulated reports in the Ukraine that over the course of that conversation, President Biden had promised Ukraine a NATO membership action plan. Well, I now turn to the actual readout provided by the White House of this conversation, which took place on 7th June 2021. It's not very long and it's rather vague, and I'm going to read it out in full. President Joseph R. Biden Jr. spoke today with President Volodymyr Zelensky of Ukraine. The leaders discussed our strategic partnership in support of President Zelensky's plan to tackle corruption and implement a reform agenda based on our shared democratic values and Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations that delivers justice, security and prosperity to the people of Ukraine. President Biden affirmed the United States' unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of ongoing Russian aggression in Donbass and Crimea. The leaders also discussed the need for close cooperation on energy security and the fight against COVID, including US plans to provide 900,000 vaccine doses to help Ukraine address the pandemic. President Biden invited President Zelensky to visit Washington later this summer. Now, there is no reference in this readout to President Biden offering Ukraine a NATO membership action plan. And in fact, in the hours after those reports from Ukraine began to circulate, which said that Biden did indeed do such a thing, the US authorities actually denied that this was the case and said that President Biden did not, in fact, offer Ukraine a NATO membership action plan over the course of this telephone conversation. And then a few hours later, the Ukrainians changed their account of the conversation, admitting that President Biden did not offer Ukraine a NATO membership action plan, saying that instead it was President Zelensky who floated the possibility and that President Biden was non-committal. So here we see an example of President Zelensky trying, in effect, to bamboozle the US into a NATO action membership plan, which it has no intention at the moment of granting. That is an extremely strange thing to do, obviously an extraordinary breach of diplomatic protocol, And given that what Zelensky and his officials were quite obviously, quite intentionally doing, which is misrepresent the words of the American president, it was actually an outrageous and reckless thing to do, and one which, if done with another country than the United States and with another leader than President Biden, I say that because President Biden is well known for being a very tolerant human being. If it were done with someone else, it might have landed both Zelensky and Ukraine in very serious trouble. What it has done, by the way, in the meantime, is confirm something which the Ukrainians probably would not have wanted confirmed. This is that the United States, at the present time, has no intention of offering Ukraine a NATO membership action plan. So this ploy of Zelensky's to try to stampede the Americans into giving Ukraine a NATO membership action plan has backfired and has achieved the opposite. The other thing that President Zelensky was trying desperately to do was to set up a meeting with President Biden before Biden meets with Putin on 16th June 2021. No doubt, and I've no doubt about this, what Zelensky was angling for was an invitation to the G7 summit meeting in Cornwall and to the NATO meeting, which is due to take place in a few days after in Brussels. President Biden will, of course, be attending both those meetings. President Zelensky hoped that he would be able to wangle an invitation to these meetings and was clearly hoping to meet Biden at these meetings before Biden meets Putin on the 16th of this month. Well, that has also failed to happen. Going back to the readout, what it says is President Biden invited President Zelensky to visit Washington later this summer. Later this summer obviously means not at the G7 meeting in Cornwall and not at the NATO meeting in Brussels, but sometime in over the course of the next few weeks after President Biden has returned to Washington from Europe and well after he has met President Putin in Geneva on the 16th of June. In fact, the latest reports and suggestions we are hearing is that this meeting between Biden and Zelensky in Washington will probably take place sometime in July. So again, this attempt by the Ukrainians to try to strong-arm the Americans into doing something which the Americans had no intention of wanting to do has backfired. It has instead ended up with Zelensky getting a meeting with Biden, but one which has been pushed in effect back to the end of the queue. The result is that instead of the Ukrainians being able to get from the Americans commitments to Ukraine, which might have been expected to show off the strength of Ukraine's support in Washington, what they have managed instead is to get a situation in which, on the contrary, the Americans have acted in a way which shows how low a priority Ukraine has become for them. And in fact, if we go back to the readout of that conversation between Biden and Zelensky, the striking thing about it is how cliche-ridden it is. Note words like this. The leaders discussed our strategic partnership in support of President Zelensky's plan to tackle corruption and implement a reform agenda based on our shared democratic values and Ukraine's Euro-Atlantic aspirations that delivers justice, security, and prosperity to the people of Ukraine. Now, not only is that a cliche, it's in fact a demand by the Americans directed at Zelensky and Ukraine that they carry out certain reforms to tackle corruption and implement a reform agenda, conditional upon which is American support. So again, what looks like a statement of support in the readout turns out on careful examination to be no such thing. It turns out to be a demand rather than a statement of support. And then, of course, there's the next sentence. President Biden affirmed the United States' unwavering commitment to Ukraine's sovereignty and territorial integrity in the face of ongoing Russian aggression in Donbass and Crimea. Well, that's a cliche. It doesn't actually amount to a commitment by the United States to actually do anything. They're not going to promise, for example, to defend Ukraine in the face of an attack. And clearly, there is no discussion of an alliance here, and certainly no discussion of any possible NATO action plan or NATO membership for Ukraine at any point in the future. Let's even consider the next sentence, which is, of course, the sentence where the United States does make a commitment to Ukraine. The leaders also discussed the need for close cooperation on energy security in the fight against COVID-19, including US plans to provide 900,000 vaccine doses to help Ukraine address the pandemic. Ukraine's population is probably somewhere between 35 and 40 million people. 900,000 vaccine doses is a drop in the ocean compared to Ukraine's needs. So the United States is not really providing Ukraine with that much support to combat the pandemic. As I understand it, over the last few months, the United States has been vaccinating its people at the rate of about 1 million vaccinations a day. It's less than a day of US vaccinations, which the Ukraine is being promised. Hardly again a sign that the United States at the moment rates Ukraine at any very high level of priority. All very disappointing for President Zelensky and for Ukraine in general. But why are the Ukrainians pushing in this way? Why are they taking action like misrepresenting President Biden's words and pushing for a summit meeting that the Americans are unenthusiastic about, which in a way that will only ends up emphasizing how low a priority they have become for Washington at this time? Well, the short answer is that at one level, Ukraine's entire diplomatic initiatives at the moment are running into the sand. Their attempts to set up a summit meeting between themselves and President Putin of Russia have been in effect rejected. The Russians have said that no progress on setting up that summit meeting have been made in discussions with the Ukrainians. The alternative plan to set up a Normandy 4 meeting, that is to say a summit meeting where Zelensky and Putin will meet each other in the company of Angela Merkel of Germany and Emmanuel Macron of France. Apparently that's also run into the sand too, with the Russians skeptical and the French and the Germans unenthusiastic. And to cap all of that, we've now had more reports about the situation in Ukraine itself. Now, there have been a number of reports in Washington Examiner, a conservative American news site which is strongly supportive of Ukraine, from one of its journalists who has recently toured the front lines along the ceasefire line and who has met with Ukrainian troops there. And without wanting to overstate things, I didn't get the impression, reading those reports, that the journalist or the reporter found the Ukrainian troops in particularly good shape. I reported some weeks ago that, in my opinion, keeping large numbers of troops in the field on the contact line for weeks upon week on end would only result in the troops becoming demoralized and degraded. And that, I suspect, is what is happening. Because having moved his troops to the contact line in March, Zelensky seems unable to withdraw them, with the result that they have been left there, out in the open, in the heat, or alternatively in the cold, and they are becoming increasingly demoralized and run down. Now, that was what I gleaned from those articles in Washington Insider. The Russians, or news sites which are sympathetic to the Russian position, are of course going much further than this. And there's been an article in on a news site called South Front, which I should stress the State Department considers to be aligned with the Russian intelligence agency, which goes much further than that. I should quickly add in parenthesis that South Front itself strongly denies that it has any connection to the Russian government, let alone the Russian intelligence services. I've no way of independently verifying that one way or the other. I would say that in my experience, their reporting on military matters has tended to be accurate and reliable, but I repeat again that it is a site which has been identified as Russian aligned, so people are at liberty to take its reporting with as big a pinch or indeed a mountain of salt as they please. Anyway, it refers to a report, allegedly an internal Ukrainian report, about the state of the military, the Ukrainian military in eastern Ukraine, which speaks of a military there, a Ukrainian military, which is becoming increasingly demoralized and despondent. And it reels off various statistics, all of which purport to be drawn from an internal Ukrainian document whose authenticity, I want to stress, I cannot corroborate or verify, but which, if it is true, presents a bleak picture. It says, for example, that 84% of Ukrainian military personnel do not feel responsible for the result of hostilities, that 80% are not ready to carry out real combat missions, that 72% rate their readiness to participate in armed conflicts as low, that 64% regularly use alcohol or drugs, that 63% are unsure of their fellow servicemen, that 53% have got tired of their long stay in the combat zone. That, by the way, I'm fully willing to believe. That 38% report a negative assessment of their service amongst the civilian population. It goes on to report that there have been problems of desertion and even of bribe taking on the part of Ukrainian military officers. Let me repeat again, this purports to be from a Ukrainian internal document, but it is published on a website that has been flagged by the State Department as Russian controlled. A claim which that particular website, South Front, vehemently denies. You can believe that or not, as you wish, but it is not inconsistent with what I read in those Washington Insider reports. So that is about all I can say about the state of the Ukrainian military. There's also been a very interesting article by a Russian commentator, Anatoly Karlin, on the state of the Ukrainian economy. Now, Karlin, again, is a person with Russian nationalist views. He is somebody who is politically opposed to the Maidan government in Ukraine, but he is not uncritically opposed. He has spoken in the past rather favorably about Ukraine's prospects, and he is also a critic of President Putin of Russia. And what he reports is of an economy that is being gradually and relentlessly hollowed out, one which since around 2010 has lost around a third of its manufacturing capacity, whose agricultural production is stagnating in some ways, and which seems to have lost most of the more effective and important parts of the of its industrial sector, especially that part of it which dealt with high technology goods. Karlin emphasizes, rightly, that Ukraine is not in any particular state of economic collapse. Any claims to that effect are wild exaggerations, but perhaps economic collapse is, or could even be said to be, beneficial to an economy in some respects if it is in a state of secular decline, as Ukraine's appears to be. I say that because an economic collapse, such as the one that happened in Russia in 1998, and which came very close to happening in Russia in 2008, can force changes in economic direction. An economy that is in a state of continuous and remorseless decline, by contrast, if no economic collapse happens, will simply continue with that decline. I would add that for me, the single most eye-catching statistic amongst the ones that Karlin published were ones that showed that the ratio of Ukrainian to Russian meat production has declined from 43% in 1990 to just 23% in 2019. Remember, Ukraine previously had a very strong agricultural economy, and that meat consumption in Russia, which is now comparable to OECD levels, is now almost twice as high as in Ukraine up to at least 2019. So there we are, a deteriorating economic situation and a military situation on the contact line which does not look good, with a Ukrainian army that looks as if it is becoming increasingly demoralized, probably in part because of its many structural problems, but also undoubtedly because of the way in which large numbers of men are being kept indefinitely in the field with nothing very much to do. So it is not surprising, perhaps, that President Zelensky, in this kind of situation where he can't advance and can't retreat, has been desperately trying to find a way out, either by getting some kind of meeting set up with Biden or getting some kind of commitment for Ukraine's NATO membership agreed to, or by trying to get some sort of meeting with Putin set up. None of these initiatives, however, is working, because the one thing President Zelensky is not prepared to do is make the necessary concessions, or perhaps one shouldn't even call them concessions, movements which might actually result in a breakthrough, which would result in Ukraine escaping from the cul-de-sac that it has found itself in. Though that breakthrough would require Ukraine to do that which it committed itself to do in the Minsk Agreement of 2015, which is to open direct negotiations between itself and the leaders of the two breakaway republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. The Ukraine, on the contrary, has not only categorically refused to do this, going against the commitments it made in Minsk in February 2015, but it has, with increasing feverishness and indeed even an element of desperation, sought a way to break away from those commitments and to get the backing of the West in doing so. All that is achieving is it is prolonging and deepening Ukraine's agony. Sometimes difficult decisions to open negotiations, to find a route out of a conflict, have to be made. Otherwise, the problems that a intransigent position creates simply deepen. There is a concept in international relations theory called entrapment. Entrapment is where a party to a conflict finds itself entrapped in an unsustainable position that it is incapable simultaneously of retreating from. And international relations scholars discuss at length how difficult it is for a party to a conflict which finds itself in that kind of entrapped situation to escape from it, but how necessary that becomes. Well, Ukraine is in that state of entrapment, and the sooner its leaders grasp that fact, the better for its people it will be. Thank you for joining me for this video today on this subject. I look forward to you joining me in future videos, both on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend, Alex Christoforou. Please also join us on our other platforms, BitChute, Odyssey, SuperU, and Locals. And please also support us to the extent that you can via PayPal, Patreon, and Subscribestar. Last but not least, please go to our Discord server and check out our shop and the wonderful things that you will find there. And also, please remember to check your subscription to this channel and to press the like button if you liked this program. Thank you very much for joining me today on this tangled subject about Ukraine, and I look forward to you joining me again, and have a wonderful day until then.